everyone, welcome to the third episode of the Filipino Australian Lawyers Association, where we aim to highlight the unique stories of members of our community and explore their experiences navigating both cultures, legal practices, and communities. I am Eliza Dianne Mapili, and I'm grateful to host this podcast series for you. In this episode, we are joined by one of our inaugural executive committee members, Janeca Gross. As an admitted Australian lawyer, Janeca shares with us her journey as a later lawyer and her experiences in policy work within various Victorian executive departments. Janeca's experiences within government is further cemented as she is the current Vice President of the Australian Philippine Business Council Victorian chapter, where she advocates for stronger bilateral ties between Australia and the Philippines in business, trade, and investment. Please join us for the conversation. Hi everyone, welcome to the third episode for the Filipino Australian Lawyers Association, and thank you, Janeca, for agreeing to share your experiences with us in your extensive work in government and policy within the Victorian Public Service, and also sharing your experiences and initiatives through the Australian Philippines Business Council, which I think serves to strengthen the two countries' bilateral relations and ties in the private sector. So I'll be really excited to know more about that. I understand that you're a later lawyer. So firstly, could you share us more about your pre-law background, your education, and your work experience in the Philippines and prior to migrating to Australia, and your motivations to migrating to Australia? Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here and be invited to speak. Before I begin, I just wanted to acknowledge where I'm streaming from. I am coming from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to our elders past and present, streaming from the southeastern sides of Melbourne. So my personal background before I became a qualified lawyer, I was working in the private sector. I grew up in the Philippines, left at 19, and then I moved to Dubai for a work experience. As a graduate, I was doing a marketing role for a consumer electronics company. And then 4 years later, I moved to Melbourne on a skilled migrant visa. And luckily, I had enough points to actually, migrate as a migrant. And I didn't study law straight away. It took me, I think, 7 years before I resumed law degree. So I was mulling over whether to go for it or not. And I went to the US for like 2 months to some sort of, find my path where I should be. So that was GFC. If younger people might not remember it, but it's the global financial crisis back in 2009 and 10. And so I had to kind of go back to Australia and see that, it's a lot more, I guess, progressive here in terms of a lot of the benefits for migrants. So I then, that made me decide to stay and work here. So I decided to apply for my Juris Doctor degree. I also started looking for work in the public sector. So I found a full-time role at the Department of Justice at the time. And then I enrolled at Monash Uni initially for their Juris Doctor program, which somehow kind of really toughened me up on a lot of things because it was a 3-hour lecture after work. So
so you were studying
so many hours. But I couldn't sustain it. So I moved to RMIT and got all my credits transferred there. But I completed it eventually and practiced in community legal center and some exposure to intellectual property boutique firm. I also did some policy work within the VPS looking at legislation. And I quite enjoyed that side of lawmaking rather than the private practice. So I was a mature student I was, I think, 28 when I started the law degree and then finished at 33. So it took me around 5 years. I gained admission the year after. So I decided to stay in the Victorian public sector after I finished. And yeah, and haven't really ventured mu out much since then, but I
Mm,
took a lot of volunteer roles
yeah.
with the community and the Business Council, and also a lot of the DI associations and organizations within the public sector.
Yes, going deeper to because I'm really interested about your government work and your public policy work in the Victorian Executive Board branch, and I think you've worked a lot with various departments within the Victorian Executive departments and branches. So, firstly, you worked a significant time in the Department of Justice and Community Safety. Could you explain more
Yes.
about your work there and your experiences working in that department?
Yeah, sure. So with the Department of Justice, I was at the regulation side of industry. So that
Mhm,
means in consumer affairs and regulation. So it included a whole range of sectors
mhm,
that real estate, renting, secondhand dealers. There's also work on state consumer affairs law.
mhm,
So that was the time when the Australian consumer law was being implemented
mm,
um, as part of the wider Commonwealth legislation.
mhm.
So there's distinctions between what the state can do and what the national or the federal laws can do.
Mhm.
So highly involved somehow in the implementation of some of these Section 18 misleading and deceptive
Yeah.
conduct. But but my bulk of my role in the end was dealing with the amending the legislation for renters. So a lot
Mhm.
of our younger people really struggle to find, like first home
Mm.
ownership.
Yeah.
So next best alternative was to rent long term. So that became kind of like a big policy change to
Yeah.
enable long-term leasing without
Mhm.
fear of being evicted or
Mhm.
loosening up some laws with what you can do for a rental place.
Yeah.
And we looked into experiences in various jurisdictions
Mhm.
in Europe and OECD countries in Asia.
Mhm.
So that was really a good kind of exposure to a whole range of law reform making, because you don't
Yeah.
just see what's happening here, you also
Comparative. Yeah. Mhm.
explore the best practice
Mhm.
that's been implemented out there and what you
Mhm.
could adapt. So, but yeah, you,
Yeah.
you don't always adapt most of these things because our landscape's different, but
Yeah. Mhm.
take the best from what they have experienced.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
going forward, now that your current work is in with the Department of Energy and Environment and Climate Action. So could you explain more about that? What your current work right now?
Yeah, my current role, I work with the portfolio governance areas where we look after the environment protection portfolio. So
Mhm.
it's handled by a department that includes EPA, Sustainability Victoria,
Mhm.
Commission for Environmental Sustainability, and anything in relation to environment protection. So um, I look after the governance side of aspects of all handling
Yeah.
the environment protection entities. So,
Mhm.
but I work as part of a small team.
Mhm.
We're all in the senior positions in our roles,
Mhm.
so we collaborate and exchange insights and best practices across the work area that I'm part of.
Mm. But I understand you're really majority and significant part of your work is in the government and public policy, and what really just means that you are able to coordinate that with strengthening your Filipino and Australian ties with the Australian Philippines Business Council, and now you're the current vice president for the Victorian chapter. Could you talk more about your experiences in that council and the initiatives that it provides in the community? Yeah.
Yeah, so to answer the question about my current role with the Australia Philippines Business Council, I
Mhm.
took the role late 2022, so I
Mhm.
was appointed in 2023.
Mhm.
Um, it's a role which is kind of dear to me because it goes back into the private sector experience that I've had when I
Mhm.
started my career.
Mhm.
Um, but it also more touches more on the advocacy side of
Yeah.
the Business Council, which is
Mhm.
strengthening bilateral relations and economic and trade partnerships between
Mhm.
companies in the Philippines, Australia, and the government.
Mhm.
So at the moment, there is a strategy that the Australian government has committed to.
Mhm.
It's the Nicholas Moore report on the ASEAN 2040 strategy,
Mhm.
which we have been using as a guiding principle of where we should be heading. I
Mhm.
encourage everyone who's interested in bilateral relations to look into it because Australia is really positioning itself to reach more markets and
Mhm.
strengthen its partnership with Asia, particularly the ASEAN countries, like the 10 member states in ASEAN.
I noticed that you're very active in the community, particularly in events in the Philippines Business Council with FALAW and also with the Color Network in the Victorian Public Service. So I want to ask, like, what are the events coming up that you are good for people to join and engage in? Particularly, I wanted to know about the PAOS that we were talking about on
Oh,
Monday.
sure.
So
Yes.
yeah, could you please elaborate more about that? Yeah.
Yeah. So to, I think every 6 months, if not every year, the
Mhm.
Philippine Consulate General in Melbourne hosts a post-arrival orientation seminar for international students and
Mhm.
any temporary or permanent residents and newly arrived migrants. I I also kind of started looking into how we can embed some of our current networks into the
Mhm.
wider community.
Mhm.
For instance, at the UP alumni in Victoria, we've started opening up our membership to non-alumni, but
Mhm.
also interested to network and be part of our mentoring program. So I want to
Mhm.
plug that as well for those who have recently um, come to Melbourne and looking for new networks, and also those who have settled here but are looking for some direction in their career. The UP alumni mentoring program is open to anyone who's in that phase of life,
Mhm.
looking for someone to be kind of um,
Guide.
yeah, a valuable contribution to your personal growth as well as
Mhm.
professional, mostly professional, but also personal growth in
Mhm.
as a migrant.
Mhm.
And it's also more kind of having that one-on-one connection with someone
Mhm.
who have grown up in the Philippines is also
Mhm.
what our emphasis is.
Yeah.
Um, Not having that network before, it was okay having to have a mentor who's not from a Filipino background, but it
Mhm.
makes it it's enriching to have someone from the same background too.
Mhm.
Um, so
That
yeah,
you
that's an
resonate
option
with. Yeah.
if you're interested in those things.
Yeah. But that sums up all my questions. But thank you, Janica, for today, for sharing your experiences with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. See you later.
Thank you for joining us for a third episode of the FALAW Podcast series. Janica's journey is a great representation of the work of Filipino Australian lawyers in government and their wider contribution to wider Australian public policy. Janica's advocacy also extends to strengthen Philippine-Australian bilateral relations, aiming to maximize potential trade and investment opportunities between these two countries. If you have any content for us that you would like to highlight, please reach out to our social media pages. I am Dianne Mapili, and with the team, thank you for continuing to tune in for our FALAW podcast series, and make sure to subscribe to the next episode. See ya.